Welcome to Subjective Objectives. I'm Quinn, and this is Ryan, and we got some interesting stuff to talk to you about today.
How you doing, brother? How's it going?
Man, I'm doing great. I had a great morning, walked around with the dog, got a little cappuccino, which is my absolutely favorite choice of caffeine injection into my body. And yeah, man, I don't know. Things are going well. Sun is out. Texas is booming, so I know we got the Delta variant coming in, but I think people are handling it pretty well down here. Most people are wearing masks, so it's working out.
Nice. Yeah, that's good. Up here, yeah, it's kind of the same thing. Now, we're not quite in the mask zone yet, but everything's still pretty south of us as far as the COVID Delta variant goes. But enough about COVID. Let's brighten the mood a little bit. And how do you feel about talking about a little bit of raw materials today, buddy?
Yeah, guys. So our topic for today is going to be raw materials. Our initial thought was like, hey, how did COVID? We know COVID affected the price of raw materials. How much of it was kind of built in to the market, as we kind of discussed in the last episode a little bit, and how much of it is directly caused by COVID. And just really some interesting tidbits about raw materials and all the innards in general. So yeah, Lamp, why don't you get started?
All right. So you guys will notice that I always like to start off by kind of defining what we're talking about. So obviously this time we're talking about raw materials. Most of us know it's things like gold, copper, iron, aluminum, steel,
Cotton, any agriculture, soybeans.
Yes, exactly. So that's obviously what we think about later in this topic. I have a couple interesting questions about maybe something that's a little bit less tangible, but we'll get there in the meantime. So Quinn, what was something that stuck out to you? What was the first thing that you really noticed as far as interesting or what really just stuck out?
I think when you look at raw materials, the first thing you go to when you're trying to decipher what's going on is you look directly at the prices. And so, yeah, prices went up all through the board, all at the end of 2020, or really most of 2020. Prices are skyrocketing for most major raw materials, but there definitely were some big surprises to me. One of the biggest surprises to me was that agricultural commodities were definitely priced higher, but not through the roof. We've seen worse effects from other historical disasters that have had a worse effect on agricultural commodities as a raw material in general. But obviously, house building raw materials I think were greatly affected. So we have lumber and steel. Lumber itself, in a typical abnormal like business cycle, right? This would be like the worst case normal business cycle without recession. You could see a price change of like 26%, increase or decrease based on what stage of the business cycle lumber is in. And so May of 2021, we see 114% increase. So that is clearly 5 times above the worst business cycle increase. So there's obviously a direct COVID effect on lumber, and especially in America. That's because we import a lot of lumber. I know South America is one of those, and South America was also one of the countries that was greatly affected by COVID. I think Brazil still has one of the worst COVID cases around. I mean, I think it's just not going very well there. There in India is kind of the worst. So lumber definitely takes big hits.
You said one thing that you probably knew I was eventually going to want to talk about, but imports, man. And we talked about this with our last episode with the auto industry, the auto transport industry. We do not have nearly, in my opinion, enough exports compared to imports. We import so much as a consumption society. We talked about last time how 70% about of our GDP is consumption. And we rely so heavily on imports. And what the COVID did as far as, shutting down the production processes and the supply chains along the way. I mean, if you were a supply chain professor right now, you probably had a heyday because you couldn't explain you couldn't have a better situation to try and explain something, So like lumber, we import a decent amount of lumber, and what that does is it causes, obviously you have to pay taxes on it, you have to do this, and all of these things we end up relying on other countries. Well, when all these countries had shut down because of, COVID, all of a sudden they couldn't get as much. Everyone needed more, the demand goes up, and all of a sudden the prices are going way up. And I'm a firm believer that, in the U.S. we need to find a stronger source of exports, and I will always say that until I feel comfortable about it. Maybe one day that changes, and so I don't have to say it, but we just don't import, or we just don't export enough, and we can't supply enough for all of our people here in America, and it throws through our show of consumption. Now, lumber is not the only example of that. There are other examples of that. We could talk about steel. Yeah. We could talk about iron. We could talk about copper.
Just to go back to that point, though, I do want to provide my perspective on that issue. So I know you're very set on the fact that, as a country, we need more exports, and maybe we need more exports. Maybe we need more production. Definitely a little bit more production. But the U.S. can ramp up on production if needed. I think a recent example is ventilators. When ventilators production had a big problem, we saw a lot of companies stepping in and immediately producing ventilator units, which was pretty impressive. I don't think all of it can be blamed directly on production, because you obviously had some consumption demand issues, because you had the economy was going down because COVID was happening, and interest rates were already low from the Fed, so you had people that were still trying to buy houses. There was a high demand for houses. It's a huge buyer. Anybody in the country right now, it's August 8th, 2021, knows that it's an extremely expensive housing market right now. So you have this huge demand. So everybody's building houses because they want to sell those houses to make a bunch of money. So they're having to pay those higher prices for these goods. And that's probably driving up the cost of those raw materials a little bit. So it's a little bit of a combination, and not just the fact that we're like importing, but even if you were to precisely blame importing for our woes, which is a very reasonable conclusion considering COVID, because that's exactly what happened. We definitely the global system was like, holy crap! Like, this is a pandemic that we have not seen in modern society at all. Like, when was the last time something like this happened? Like 1914, when like globalization was like maybe just starting to bloom, like in certain parts of the world. Imperialization, where we were kind of exploiting labor in other parts of the world, was definitely happening. But globalization itself, where we allowed other countries to specialize in certain forms of production, it wasn't around like it is today. So I just think that we had a crisis, and I think what will come of this, though, is countries working together to work around the next pandemic. While we may have had massive supply issues all around the world, and we'll continue to have those as global issues arise, I think that we'll get better at it. But that's just a hope. I can see both sides of the coin.
Well, you make a good point there, Quinn. I obviously am a huge person on the exports, but I'm not blaming that solely. Obviously I believe that's a part of it, as you said. But you did kind of bring up something that maybe just think. What do we think? We talk about lumber, we talk about all these other things. If there was one resource or raw material that you think America should be exporting, what would you, if you had the choice, if we were to say we had all the access to it, obviously.
Well, I think when you're talking raw material, maybe production, you could have that conversation, but like what are we manufacturing? Sure, we might be able to try to produce more, and I don't know specifically what we'd want to produce more. I'd have to look into that. But raw materials we can't choose. That's the biggest problem, is that nobody chooses what raw materials they produce. If they can grow, mine, acquire those raw materials, they're going to. And I think the biggest and most dangerous and most critical that everybody else thinks about is rare earth minerals, right? It's like It's where we
REEs, yeah.
Yeah. It's where we get our all of our renewable energy that everybody's so big on right now. Well, 70 to 80% of that market comes from Chinese controlled companies. So I think that's like a critical security issue that like a lot of people worry about, and that's legit. But there's also nothing we can do about it. Like we can't produce our own molybdenum. We just don't have any stocks in our country. So
You answered that pretty much perfectly. It was not a trick question, but that's what I was trying to get at is, unfortunately, with raw materials, we don't get to choose which ones we have, and that was, like I said, you answered that perfectly. So that forces us in certain ways, if we want to be as efficient as possible, technically speaking, and this is hypothetical or theoretical, but globalization would be the best option then, right? Because if we have a complete globalized economy, or and I'm not saying I'm for this because I'm not saying that, but if we were to, then we would truly have a fully integrated system. We wouldn't have to worry about necessarily, or we wouldn't have to be as likely have happen breakdowns in our supply chain.
We wouldn't be worried about critical scarcity. Like we wouldn't be worried about those things.
Exactly.
You're saying like in a perfectly peaceful world.
Right. The problem with it is we don't have all of this checks and balances, or the supply chains, or even the labor in the right areas, or the economies in the right places to have all of these resources or raw materials available to us at the time that you need them, or at the price that we can afford them. And obviously, when you start to get into the private industries and things like that, it brings up this is where I will say it brings up a little bit of concern for me, is the ability for companies to move, like a Chinese national company, to move from basically tax from here to tax to avoid taxes there, or same as any multinational is able to move from country to country. And is that who's owning these raw materials? If you think about like diamonds, there's basically a duopoly on diamonds, because there's only two real diamonds.
That is a very specific industry though, because there's actually not a shortage of anything in diamonds. They actually manufacture the price of diamonds. They manufacture how many diamonds are in the market. It's a completely falsified good. It's a completely arbitrary price that they decide. It's not based on the demand or supply, because they create the demand. They create the existence of the diamonds, so that they kind of, like you said about the duopoly, diamonds are like almost the most unique market of raw materials in the world, because it's not really like it's not like it's
iron or steel or copper or something. It's a little bit more of it's almost like as economists we talk about like really valuable like paintings like from Picasso. It's its own market. It doesn't really have a normal tendency compared to other goods. It's not like it acts like hamburger versus steak, where it's
it's why you can buy a diamond. Good. It's why you can buy a diamond when you go to those home countries for like a tenth or a 20th or a 50th of the price. It's just here in the West and in the East where remote areas from these diamonds where they manufacture the price to be higher than it is.
But still, that brings up the point of, having that resource, is crucial for certain economies. And, what resources your country has. And America's a big place. We have to have some kind of decent raw materials. The problem with it is, as we deplete them more, you actually have to spend more and more energy to get that high level of steel. So, when you want to extract ore, if you keep extracting ore, there's certain grades of it. But as you dig more and more of it up and you get rid of all the good grade ore, it takes more of that lesser grade ore and more energy to make it that higher grade, like whether it's steel or iron or whatever it is. And so I think I have it here somewhere. Where is it? It's about... So primary metals and metal mining sector, I have it here. It's accounting for 56% of the total 3.8 billion pounds of toxic waste put into our atmosphere. And if you think about that, that's basically saying of all the mining that's done, wherever it's done on the United States or in South America or Africa or Europe or wherever it's done, it's going to take more and more energy to continue to get the same graded materials. If that's the case, shouldn't we be concerned about trying to find more efficient materials like stronger plastics and things like that? But then you always get the other side of it is, well, you don't want more plastic because plastic ends up bleeding into the ocean, and the ocean ends up, that's our ultimate, filter system. Really, the ocean is really our ultimate filter system. Without the ocean, it's a lot of, terrible things would happen. But the source of these raw materials has somewhat of a control over the price. Even now, diamonds, like we said, is obviously a little bit different, but really, if we had all the graphite in the world, and obviously we don't, it's a lot of it's over in India and over in Nepal and areas like that. But if we had all the graphite in the world, we could maybe find a better use if we had truly controlled the raw material. The problem is we don't. The private corporations are controlling these raw materials, and they're making, a lot more money than I can ever imagine off of. And then when you talk about imports and exports, you had taxes and everything, it's all of a sudden it seems like it comes into basically a misallocation of money, and we're either not charging the right amount, and the buyers are paying either too much or too little, but it's causing trouble for certain people, like construction builders, like these people that are trying to build houses, like these smaller business people that are doing it, because these larger corporations.
I will disagree with you there, because I think raw materials is like most raw materials. They're obvious. Like, again, I almost want to throw diamonds out of the discussion because it's completely different. But most raw materials are very true. They're almost like, it's almost the truest supply and demand there is in this economy. Like, it's the most basic form of the economy. So it's like, I don't think anyone, like, I mean, yes, obviously, some private companies and governments will be trying to price gouge in some regard, but not really. It's like very hard to not stay true to the raw material price. I think companies are going to charge higher when they can, but there are enough businesses out there that are that are harvesting these raw materials in most situations that there's a good agricultural commodities in general, like, it's just a very, very supply and demand related. Like, there's not much market manipulation there. It's very true to the price of what the demand is and how much supply there is. Whether there's bad weather one year, prices are going to go up because they're growing those prices. It stays true to the raw material itself. So I wouldn't say it's like that raw materials are kind of being manipulated by private companies as much as other goods and services might be.
Well, to that statement, I will agree. You, Quinn, I think are taking the more perspective I would like to have. I obviously, I'm a little bit more pessimistic towards what people are willing to do to make an extra dollar. People will. I will be the first to admit that as an economist, I believe that if people were supposed to be perfectly rational, which obviously I don't think they are, they're always in it for themselves. Yeah. And if that's the case, then there are good people out there. I'm not saying anything like that, but in general, majority of people you meet are in it for the extra dollar for themselves. And I want to believe that gold is worth what it's worth, like an ounce, or silver or copper or anything like that. But sometimes I think it's, and maybe it's just me, in the world that we live in today with all the disinformation and all the stuff that we're always thrown, that sometimes I struggle to accept that, all these prices are just going up because, as we talked about before, COVID and the continuation of times from things that happened before this rolling ball. But sometimes I just don't think that's as easily done for me, I guess. And that's why I like to keep you around to help me keep me a little bit more grounded and keep me, you know what I mean, buddy?
Man. Sometimes it's both ways. I think we keep each other grounded in a lot of regards.
But you did also bring up one other thing that was interesting, and we had obviously talked about it a little bit before. But what is the most raw natural resource? And this is something that it's more of a hypothetical question for everybody. What is the most valuable natural or raw material or raw resource? And I will throw this out there as my, kind of food for thought, and mine is time. It's not.
Oh,
It's
big
not.
shots. What a philosophical answer that was. Time.
And
Boom.
and, and so there's only so much gold, there's only so much silver, there's only so much iron, there's only so much steel, there's only so much oil, there's only there well, food, obviously stuff, regrows and all that, but there's one thing that, each individual has a set amount of time that is unknown, and every human goes through at least the same process in general. And I'm not talking about like, trials and tribulations. I'm talking about being born, living, and dying. Everyone has a set time. We don't know the time limit, but we all value our time. My issue is people don't value their time correctly. It's just
Facts.
do we value all the right raw materials correctly? Should we be putting more effort into steel to try and get high grade steel versus, trying to use aluminum or trying to use a good graded plastic for construction or any of this stuff, and it all comes down to decision making, obviously. But the one thing that this made me realize this episode that we're doing is that the most valuable resource that anyone ever has is your time. And if you're wasting that, it doesn't matter what raw materials you have. It doesn't matter what you have. It really is all secondary to the value of your time and you as an individual knowing what you are worth or feeling that you're getting what you're worth. Everyone has that own self-worth, and that's what makes us human. The key is to feel like you are being treated like what you're worth. And everyone has a different perspective on how that's done. Everyone has a different way of how it should be done. But the key is to being true to yourself and to your time and saying that this is where the most efficient way for me to spend my life, basically. And it comes through the basis of our time. How does time work? That's a totally different thing. I'm not talking about the sun here, the physics and all that kind of stuff.
Because I think it's an important question to ask our viewers and our listeners. Send us an email. Guys. Comment down below. What is your kind of key raw material that you guys believe in today's economy? Do you think it's aluminum? Do you think it's rare earth minerals? Do you think it's time? Are you gonna go all philosophic on us, guys? Just let us know. Comment, say something. What do you think is the most key raw material? Personally, I'm gonna go with water. That's kind of my key raw material for our planet. But not the raw materials we're talking about today. But yeah, I love that question, Ryan. Just kind of bringing that up, and I think it's important, because they're raw materials for a reason. They're usually finite resources, not always, but still, we need to be concerned about it. So, what is your most key raw material?
Water's it's a close second. I kind of need water to live.
Listen, time. I can't one up time, Ryan. There's no way I can beat it. So I gotta try. And
water. Hey, water's a very good one. Honestly, I'm drinking some water right here myself. So
yeah. Water values. We'll talk about that in a whole nother podcast. I was lucky enough to kind of work right next to this water in my at my last firm that I worked with. So I know a little bit about it, but we'll save it for an episode in and of itself. Ryan, you talked about monopolies versus duopolies versus a typical free market activity. How much do those entities affect prices in raw materials? Is there like a large example of raw materials that you have that are monopolies or duopolies, like you said, diamonds? But do you have like kind of other ideas or examples of of what's affected by those kind of? I mean, I can name one, like probably a big monopoly is rare earth minerals. We already said that a bunch, but there's not a company, but you could say a conglomerate of companies, basically a cartel of companies in an economic sense. Has that control in China. Now, do you think there are other raw materials affected by these monopolies and duopolies?
So there's a couple good questions in there actually, and the first one is as far as a specific industry, the first one that always comes to mind for me is actually diamonds. That's why, and I talked about it in a couple of classes before, so that's one that always keeps me fresh in mind. But to your question about the effects of what kind of market it is, that plays a huge role in the style of business, and that is ultimately what will determine the price. So, for example, if you have a monopoly, where you set your price is based off of a marginal revenue line, which is similar to like the perfectly competitive market. But the difference is where that lands among the price. So if you have like a monopoly, the graph will be a little bit different versus a perfectly competitive market. And obviously, these graphs have costs and things like that show up. But the easiest way I can explain it is through, if we talk about like a duopoly, is if you ever have done the tree, it's like a tree. They call it like a math tree kind of thing. But basically, it's a competitive decision-making process. And so, like, if you have company A and you have company B, and A can either be in the industry or A cannot be in the industry, and B is already in the industry. And so A will make their decisions based off of what they expect B to do. And so what it ends up causing is it ends up saying that this what seems like the best answer to enter and exit markets, which is how we determine what kind of market it is how easily people can either enter or exit. The barriers, those kind of things are really what determine whether it's perfectly competitive, whether it's a monopoly, whether it's a duopoly, all those kind of things. And what we see in all these things is that depending on the resource, it really determines the market. Like, for example, like diamonds, we see a duopoly in that because there's a very few firms, because the cost to enter, all of these decisions that have to go into these pricing strategies and things like that end up making it a duopoly like diamonds. Or maybe it's a little bit more competitive, like if you have steel, where there's a lot of steel companies out there. America obviously used to be a great producer of steel. We still produce some, not as much. That's a different topic. And then you have other industries, lumber. Lumber is a very important resource, but it's actually regional. Like, obviously, we don't have very many lumber
we cut
producers.
a lot of our logging operations. I actually saw some heavy logging operations in Colorado when I was there. I don't know how much we have in Alaska anymore. I know a lot of our logging industry was over there, but I'm honestly I'm not sure where most of the world's lumber comes from. Let's check it out.
But while you're doing that, so that's kind of what we determine what kind of market style each raw material is in. So it's how we do that for each company really depends on the ability for companies to either enter or exit the industry. Obviously, you have barrier cost. You'll have certain industries you have to have international transportation, then you have to have all the red flags and red tape that you have to do for that stuff, and then you have to go through customs and all these other costs. And sometimes all those costs are too much for people to enter, and so they will stay out of it, and that makes it's not perfectly competitive. Versus if you walk down a street and you have 10 city blocks of just shops, that's a truly perfectly competitive market, because anybody can go in there, start their own shop or get their own shop and start selling stuff, whatever it is. They make their own clothes, sports cards, whatever it would be. And so that's really what determines what kind of market, and then from there that market will end up setting up the style for pricing strategies for that raw material, whatever raw material that is. So the market has a lot of effects on the price of any commodity, whether it's a raw material or it's a good that's being produced. But if we're talking about raw materials, the less people that have access to it, the more control the monopoly will have over, certain price. Obviously, if there's demand is still half the equation. You can't just forget about demand in a monopoly. It's not like, oh, I own a monopoly, I make the price, you buy it. That is what it is. It's not exactly that simple for most stuff, especially when we're talking about.
Yeah, because demand still plays a factor, right? No matter how much supply is
Yeah.
controlled, ultimately the market still dictates a lot of the cost.
Exactly.
For
Yeah.
items.
Yeah, exactly. So that's really what
And
that
also
all
an
ends up coming
update,
down to.
the USA is the #1 timber and lumber producer in the world. So there it is. There's your American raw material that we were looking for. It is actually lumber. So that's cool.
So then that's kind of funny, Yet lumber.
Well, you know what? That would mean that kind of what I originally said, like coming into this, was that lumber, COVID affected lumber. It wasn't just the imports, and I think that's what kind of my point was originally, was that it was actually this kind of mix of like COVID affected the imports of maybe like some luxury woods, like specifically I know South America. I know Brazil has some of the best, hardest wood that like every producer wants. So that's definitely going to have an effect on like some of the lumber prices. But a lot of it did come from our kind of booming housing market. And like, okay, like this trend was already building up. We have low interest rates. People want to buy houses. They want to get loans on their houses. It's the best time to do it. And so people are building houses for these people to buy, and the prices are going up, and people are buying like crazy. I mean, they're still buying like crazy. And again, we find so many new topics just discussing current ones. Another topic for another time is the housing market and how homeowners are not actually always the primary purchasers, especially in these last 2 years. People who are looking for rental investments are often buying up these houses for before first home owners can actually get enough money to purchase it. That's going to be an interesting regulatory fight that I think we're going to see in the coming years. But that's for another day. Yeah, these housing prices, and I don't want to say bubble because it's not quite a bubble yet, but because of the low interest rate specifically. So people are not going into extreme debt as of this moment. It's not similar to 2008. And they're not making money off that debt anymore.
Well, you said one thing about that it's the difference between now and 2008, and the rates didn't go up yet. But if the rates start to go up, as people have the variable fixed, or now I don't want to get too far off topic, but the variable rates, they're the people that might, the people that have fixed rates that got a lower fixed rate, they're going to be okay. But those are the people that probably already have the situation where they're not hurting as bad as the people that are getting a variable rate. Because people that get variable rates are generally who? People who don't have the consistency of, showing a longer term ability to make payments, or there's a lot of factors that go into what rate and stuff you can pick or choose and all that.
That's a good point though. Like I didn't think about it that way. That the difference between variable and fixed rate loans. Sure, some people might be fine for the next 30 years, but some people might actually get screwed over when it comes down
when
to
the rates go up. Yeah, exactly. And
I was gonna say get fucked, and we can't actually say that on the show, so I don't know why I censored myself, but. But back to raw materials. I think the answer there is COVID definitely had an effect, but a weird effect on specifically the lumber raw material price, because it was the rise in lumber prices wasn't necessarily tied directly to the COVID affecting supply, and it did have an effect, but there were trends beforehand that kind of added to the demand issue that caused the rise in prices. And I'm sure that's similar with steel. I'm sure a lot of construction projects were probably started in the last couple years because the interest rates have been so low. And so that issue combined with, and I think steel is probably the best example. I don't know where I hope where the top steel producer is, but that probably had the worst effect worst effect from COVID because of the supply chain issues, right? Those supply chain pressures from around the globe probably had a bigger effect on steel than it did on lumber. I think we're finding out.
So China has the
They're the largest producer of
largest crude steel producers in 2020.
Interesting. Is it by a lot?
Yeah, it's saying here the Baowu Group is 115 million metric tons, and then the next country is, and I'm going to butcher this, ArcelorMittal. I don't even know how to say it. ArcelorMittal from Luxembourg, which is 78.46 million metric tons.
Interesting. Luxembourg.
And listen to this though. HBIS Group, also China, 43.76 million metric ton. The Shagang Group, China again, 41.49 million metric tons. These are just the first couple things that are on.
And so and dude, there were other things. I mean, one of the biggest aspects of the trade war. There were two big aspects of how the U.S.-China trade war was going to affect prices, and one was steel, and the other was agricultural commodities. We provided our 45th President Donald Trump. He actually passed subsidies to try to help farmers. So those prices were not nearly as badly affected. I mean, it was still pretty bad, but it wasn't nearly as badly affected as the steel was. So there were a lot of lead-ins. I guess there were a lot of lead-ins to the current COVID supply chain pressures that kind of allowed for steel to be at the prices they are now. Now lumber has already started to come back down. So you can see that it is tied a little bit to the COVID pandemic, but it's starting to come back down. Steel, on the other hand, still high. I don't think that they're forecasting steel to come down anytime soon. So that is pretty interesting.
I remember when the COVID crisis started happening, and I was in a financial management class, and I was actually looking at the price of steel. I remember it was like 19 or like $21, and it went up to like $26 or $27 within a couple of days, and it just stayed up there. I don't know what it's actually right now, but I know it jumped pretty quickly just because the price of steel went up. So everyone, was like, oh, let's buy this ETF or this stock or this commodity. And I do remember steel was one of the commodities that I had at the time that shot up pretty quickly. Now that was just coincidence. That wasn't like I had planned all this. That was just something that I remember, and that was coincidence at the time for this. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of give you some perspective, I don't have the exact price in steels, but in general, the metals and minerals market from 2020 Q2, which from Q1 or from 2021 was actually lower, right? So this is the very beginning of the pandemic. So we had prices drop a little bit, about 5%. In one quarter, the price increased 19.5% in metals and minerals. So that's showing how great the direct COVID impact was. That's insanity. And to this day, it's actually only increased 2.1% from that already increased 19.5. So you can, I mean, it hasn't decreased at all. So the effects are still going on today.
Which we pretty much, I think we pretty much expected that. It's just how fast can we recover is really the question now. And that's kind of what I think people want to know is how fast can we get back to a recovery. And what really is going to lead us to having any kind of clue that we're, obviously an economist, we have certain ways of finding out what stage of the economy we're in. But as a consumer, that's the general public, how soon do we feel or think that we're going to actually get back to...
and you're talking about American economy.
Yes, the American
Yeah,
economy.
I think something interesting that should be noted is that we obviously have a blessed economy. There are a lot of countries that do, but the emerging markets, right? They had their economies often rely on the production of raw materials, right? The harvesting of such raw materials. So their economies have been completely affected by the supply chain disaster and the lack of accurate demand forecasting by companies in the United States, causing things like the used car price rise, which we talked about last episode. So these emerging economies have really been hit hard by COVID, not just the disease itself, which obviously has had a huge effect, but also because their economies rely so much on these production of base metals, minerals, and materials. So that's interesting. I mean, that sucks. We're not the only people suffering here for sure.
Oh no, and I think as time goes on, and we talked about this a couple times already, mentioned it at least. The economies of the world are going to become more and more interconnected. I'm not one to say that we should have one world economy or that we shouldn't. That's not really what I'm here to talk about. But I think it does show is that we are going to rely on countries as we become more efficient and then other countries become more efficient. We talk about in economics economies of scale. Well, really, the way I kind of would hypothetically see it going is eventually the world would just be one huge economies of scale where each region is going to produce what it can do best, or it's going to like the raw materials that it has the most abundance of is what it's going to produce the most of, and like that's what they would solely focus on, and like in whether that's lumber in America or whether that's steel in Japan or China or wherever. I think you'll see kind of like micro economies of scale, like you see like out in Silicon Valley, you see the huge tech industry, everyone goes out there, or like everyone thinks I guess you could say almost oil in Houston kind of thing, or like in Texas in general, and I think what it ends up going to happen is the world should eventually get to a point where the efficiencies of markets would allow for the world to be as efficient as possible. And that's kind of what we really want, is for everything to be as efficient as possible, at least as an economist. And so how do we get there? Where do we go from here? And really the question is, the first part of this question is, we need to get to recovery. We need to start getting back to some normality in life. I understand this COVID has greatly affected families very differently, and I have no way of even having any kind of way to fathom the way it's affected everybody so differently. But what we can say is we have to stick together, and we have to keep going forward. We can't let this stuff get us scared of being and doing what we do in markets and allowing us, and Americans, that we consume. That's what we do. Is 70% of our GDP is consumption, and if we don't consume the way our economy is set up, we're gonna have difficulties in our future with debts, with things like that, and that's where I get scared. My biggest fear, really, as far as the economy goes, is taking care of our debt. Obviously in times of crisis, government's policy, they spend more, but in times of good, healthy running economies, they're supposed to be saving, they're supposed to be cutting down our debt.
I think actually it'd be a super interesting topic too one day that we talk about is, what the fuck is debt? How can we seemingly have unlimited amounts of this shit and the world is just like fine, right? I know obviously we know a little bit about the basics, but it would be cool to inform our listeners of like why, because I hear that question all the time, like how does our debt keep going up? And there's definitely some clear answers, but there's also some unanswered questions, and so I think that would be a cool topic to cover. I want to go back to just staying on the topic of raw materials. Let's talk about one raw material in particular. You mentioned it, but that is a staple of our economy, and it went through an interesting fluctuation during the pandemic. Let's talk about oil. The demand for oil right? What happened at the start of the pandemic was nobody predicted how quick. I mean, I can't not remember a time in our history, and it may not have happened since 1914, right? Or at least, okay, a time in our history after the oil boom, right? Where we just stopped completely. I mean, people stopped driving and people stopped flying at record levels, that nobody has ever seen in our globe. And so these oil producers who have been, they basically know that their shit's going to be consumed at record levels every day, and they can accurately predict their own marketplace pretty well. The oil market is one of the most true to raw material price in the world because it's produced everywhere. So it's very true, right? There's not really. I mean, there are a monopoly on certain countries. Obviously, you have the Middle East, but I mean, with the shale boom in America, it kind of went into the Wild West, and prices are just very true to the raw material itself. So oil prices, not gasoline, but oil prices, they dropped briefly, and then they dropped briefly once everybody stopped driving because they had nobody to buy their crap. They had to drop their prices. The price of oil plummeted. Almost every shale operation in the U.S., Ryan, it was incredible. I mean, they just slashed their business. They cut tens of thousands of employees. I personally know some of the victims of that event, and they slashed a ton of their workforce. Shale production almost completely came to a halt because they were generating too much for people to consume. So that had they had not predicted this. Nobody ever predicts their downturn. They always forecast their positives. But so it was a pretty incredible moment for an industry that is a staple and will continue to be a staple of the world to come. So that was a pretty incredible change. And then right now we're seeing record level prices, and people are like, oh, well, why are prices high? Is it politics? Is it this? It's like, no. I mean, we went from a moment where people had no demand to drive and fly to a moment where everybody's coming back into the world trying to drive and fly again. And so oil production's got to start back up. And one interesting tidbit about the oil and gas, and well, you're not the consumer. I'm talking to the consumer here. As a consumer, you are not purchasing oil. You're purchasing gasoline for the most part, or natural gas. But most of the time, you're worried about gasoline prices. Very different than oil prices, right? Because the raw material oil has actually been back down in price. You still see high gas prices across the United States right now, but the oil price has actually dropped back down to relatively normal levels, still relatively high, still holding up these oil companies, or still giving these oil companies a lot of recovery, which they needed, because the oil companies had crashed quite a bit during the pandemic, or at least public stock prices. So right now they've recovered a little bit. Oil prices are back down to normal, but the gasoline prices do not reflect the oil prices yet. Again, it should be lower, and people wonder why that is. And so when you talk about price manipulation, this isn't exactly manipulation, because you're still staying true to the demand, and obviously the market still is still using the prices as which it's at. But so the oil production process, Ryan, takes about 4 months to transform that oil into gasoline, to transport it to the consumer. That whole process takes about 4 months. So you usually see a 4-month delay in the reflection of oil prices to gasoline prices. Now, the gasoline company could decide to sell you that gasoline at the reduced price prior to the 4 months of the production being complete. But they don't choose to do that. It's just an interesting fact. So often companies, when oil prices rise, the gasoline companies will raise the price of oil immediately, right? Even before the 4-month production process has gone through. But when oil prices drop, those gasoline companies do not instantly react and reduce those gasoline prices, because they know they can still make the same amount of money for 4 more months while the production goes along, and nobody's going to say anything about it. So you'll see gasoline prices start to lower, but just an interesting kind of raw materials market outlook and description for you there.
That is, yeah, that's definitely, and I have one little tidbit to that might kind of also blow your mind is actually, so I'll give a shout out to Grant. He was in one of my classes at York College, and he did a project on how the crude oil, like prices of crude oil by the barrel were actually, like how they were actually figured out. And if you run regression, if anyone knows what regression is, in Excel, on some of the stuff he ran, he actually found that the futures, I believe this is what, if I remember correctly, the futures of propane were one of the best indicators of the prices of a barrel of oil. So, and to me, that just seems kind of just like, like at least as original, speculation on it, like why would that even be the case? And really no good answer comes up at first. The only thing that really would eventually come to my mind is, well, these are almost competing for the same kind of utility resource. So like, you can say propane can use to heat a house, while barrels of oil could be also used to heat a house per se. But in general, that still sometimes it comes back to my mind. I'm just like, wow, what would make futures of propane or gas have any prediction on the current prices of a barrel of oil when there's actually a pretty good correlation strength between those two in the regression model, and even if you just run that in Excel. So that I just
natural gas or propane or
I'm pretty sure it's natural gas. Sorry,
well,
I said propane.
that makes sense. I mean, it's the same industry. Natural gas is either created for propane purposes, for heating purposes, and also electricity purposes. So,
well, that's what I
sense
mean.
for
But
those to
like
be
at
pretty
first, like
heavily
you think
correlated.
about it, at least to me at first, I was like, well, these two don't. I mean, they offer the same service, but they're not really the same thing. But then when you think about it in the economics, eventually, like I said, it does kind of make a little bit more sense once you think about it. But at least at first it didn't.
Still cool that the prices are correlated that much. I mean, it does make a little bit of sense though.
Yeah. But,
we have a few more minutes. I think it'd be good to talk about agricultural commodities. Is something we haven't talked fully about yet, and that's specifically I'm gonna cater this one to the U.S. I know global agricultural commodities are a little bit different than American markets, nonetheless. But there's, again, I talked about the trade war that had an effect on agricultural commodities. I mean, we've seen in the last year, since the COVID pandemic began, definitely a price increase. I mean, I don't know if you've noticed what food items have raised in Pennsylvania. I personally don't know. But I've seen beef rise all across the country. I don't know if that's the same over there.
Yep. Yeah, it is.
Poultry, milk. I think
chicken wings, dude.
Chicken wings, dude. Unbelievable. So it's pretty interesting, I think, to talk about what's happening there. COVID's had an effect, but agricultural commodities have actually been pretty resilient. I mean, if you saw COVID affecting agricultural commodities in our country the way that they affected oil or steel or lumber, we would be paying like $40 for a hamburger. So you got to give credit to our agricultural commodity markets. Now the changes in that are a lot more due to trends. We did provide some of our U.S. farmers with some subsidies. I think 2018 or 2019, right when the trade war started to take shape. I don't know when those that aid actually comes into effect. But all COVID did was really exacerbate the current challenges facing all farmers, right? So this was crude oil prices. This is supply chain problems, right? All of a sudden, transportation companies can't pay their drivers. Truck companies can't pay their drivers enough, and so they stop delivering food. So your costs go up because there are less drivers out there to deliver that food. Regular market kind of disruptions that caused by COVID affected your agricultural market more than the agricultural commodities themselves, which was interesting. There's just consistent problems facing American farmers, and there's plenty of stuff that you guys can research to look into it, and it's almost its own topic. But I just wanted to briefly touch before we ended today on the effect, how resilient agricultural commodities really were through COVID. And yes, they were affected, but it was mostly affected by out-of-market disruptions, such as like transportation and market demand and shit like that. And so, now you're seeing just how fucking high prices can go. I mean, I have never paid so much money for ground beef in my entire life, so it's crazy.
I'm still upset about the chicken wings, dude.
Yeah, that is crazy. I did not realize how much of an effect that had on the market. I didn't go to a Wingstop in the last few months. I had some chicken wings, but yeah, I heard that a lot of places were just completely out of chicken wings. Like they couldn't even get them at all.
Yeah, I know I go to a couple places that are wing places per se, and they're not even getting the right style of wing because they're basically buying whatever they can get their hands on because they just don't have the access to the certain grades of just like you can buy certain grades of beef, you can buy a certain grade of chicken wing or certain size of chicken wing, and these places they're getting whatever they can get their hands on, and that's what they're taking, and that's what the people are going to have to pay for because there's just, like you said, I was going to add one component, but you actually touched on it at the very end, jobs. People just, with the COVID, and I get some people are scared, some people are worried for their health, and those are completely valid. But we still need to, as a society, work, and this is what I was getting at earlier, we need to work together to continue to try and progress through this so that we can get our economy back to a healthy state and start getting more jobs. Yes, like last quarter or last month we added almost 1 million jobs according to the state in PA here, but it was just
people still aren't going back to. Retail and restaurants especially, they're suffering one of the biggest labor shortages in recent history. So that's another possible interesting topic. So Ryan, we're coming to the end here of our episode, of our time, so that we can put it on YouTube for the folks to watch. And I think today we've come out with a lot of questions. One thing that Ryan and I talked about, guys, after this first episode was how each episode we can ask questions at the end, and that actually lead into future episodes. So I think one thing we talked about was infrastructure and housing. And personally, I'm curious about how expensive, why infrastructure is so expensive here in the U.S. compared to some other countries of our same status. So I think that's interesting. I think we've asked a lot of good questions here that we'll have to think about for future episodes.
Yeah, when we were going into this one, I thought I had a pretty good idea about this different raw materials and how kind of stuff worked just because of being in economics. And, this topic really got me thinking just about, a lot of different topics like production processes, misallocation of money, I could go on with the list. But with the infrastructure, and we talked about this a little bit before, but the effects of our current way of running our economy. So I'm talking about printing money, I'm talking about fiat money, I'm talking about this whole idea. And how valuable do we think the government is, or how much do we think we can actually rely on the government, and or not? And what I'm getting at is crypto. We talk about Bitcoin was a huge topic.
All right, big transition. We have 30 seconds, so we got to wrap it up. But you're right, we got a lot to talk about. If we get into cryptocurrency, that'll throw it for a loop. Hey guys, thanks so much for listening. Let us know what topic you'd like us to cover on the comments below. Thanks for listening to Ryan and I. Our next topic is going to be pretty interesting about the kind of memorabilia market and trading cards, NFTs, things like that, artwork even. So join us next time on Subjective Objectives. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, guys. Have a good one.